what I was up to. But there was a more sort of fanciful, it's a slightly abstract idea, but I think it's a, well, I guess I thought it was an interesting one because I spent a few years trying to figure it out. Idea about stories, which I'd like to try and share with you, which is that when we tell stories, or I place a certain amount of emphasis in the book on the idea of different stories kind of doing battle. We know already that the vocabulary of certain stories can be objectionable. Nobody talks about the nigger in the woodpile anymore. Nobody says "don't Jew me" when they mean they did when I was at school. You know, mean "don't rip me off." So we know how words themselves can be objectionable. We understand that like the content of stories, the version of history, especially that stories present, can be contentious. But I think there's a kind of another way in which stories do battle, and that has to do with their form, and that you know, as we have progressed as a species, and as our societies progress, we tell stories of a different kind. Now, already I'm sort of fibbing a little bit because each of us tells and employs stories in different modes at a different point in the day. But I'll dwell on three specific ideas, and that is that you can distinguish between what the myth, the epic story, and the novel. And the reason this is my other sort of more highfalutin argument for why novels are important. In the myth world, and we're not so far from it, I went up to the Arctic where 50 years before communities basically were struggling just to be able to replicate themselves, and you know, starving if the winter was long and too cold, and it's very vivid in the memory. And certain kinds of stories, and the way these stories can be differentiated is in a couple of important aspects, but most of all in their presentation of the idea of good and evil. So if you look at these myth stories in societies where kind of everybody's necessary just in the task of getting on, and where the natural world is somewhat overwhelming, as it was in the Canadian Arctic through, you know, disease and famine and everything. Good and evil are kind of, they're just presences in the world. They're just forces, and there's no great moral weight attached to them. They're things that can enter into your lives at any time. We've found other ways of explaining bad things happening, but in this myth world, in mostly oral stories told by societies at this level of subsistence, but not exclusively by them, you have to find a way of telling a story that doesn't waste your energy. So a lot of stories were designed to explain things like the existence of death, for instance, or, as I say, famine, or an overly long winter, in a way that sort of, we call them creation myths, explained these aspects of the world into existence without overly enraging people, because it was sort of a useless fight. When a couple of societies come into contact with each other, a different thing happens, and often there's trade between these two societies, and there's often a kind of a contest. And so the story takes on a sort of a different purpose, because the task of survival, which most stories are about, becomes sort of aimed at this rival society. And you know, there's a kind of an economic basis to this too, but you get the possibility of a hero, you get a possibility of a leader, you get the possibility of somebody who owns more than other people, and that's, you know, what becomes the basis of trade between these two societies. But you have a kind of story that arises, we know it from the Middle Ages in particular, but again, it's still going on, as I'll get to in a moment, which, the purpose of which, and I call it the epic, is to defend the integrity of the society. And as you do this, you sort of sing the virtues of this, the society you're part of, and you damn the one that you're not. So you talk, for instance, about things like the mother of all evil, or the axis of evil. And then you have the novel, and you know, we've learned in our society to somewhat dismiss it. It's regarded as a bit of a frippery, as an indulgence. It's not an accident that it's characterized by many more intolerant members of the right wing as a kind of indulgence, you know, people living off the grants and so on. It's regarded as something completely excessive and not important to our lives. But it is actually fabulously critical, because when you read a novel, no matter what novel you're reading, you make a kind of, the author first of all makes what's called like an imaginative leap. He tries to imagine, the author may be a person like myself, trying to imagine what it is to be a soldier in Afghanistan, or if you've read Deborah Ellis, a child in an Afghan child, or you could be imagining a kid working in a fashion magazine in New York. It doesn't matter. You're leaping into the mind of another character, and when you do that, you're sort of reminding yourself through the act. This is not, I'm not saying people do it self-consciously, but you could only do it if you thought that the other person and yourself are sort of alike, that you share what we call a common humanity. So, and when you as readers pick up this book, it's the same thing. You're following on the heels of the author's leap, and you're sort of reinforcing this idea that we're all, of our universal aspect, that we're all basically alike. If you're dealing in epic terms, you don't do that. You can call the Taliban detestable scumbags very easily. And there's a reason for that. I alluded earlier to the sort of battle that's going on in between versions of Canada. I'm older than you. I grew up in possibly the most fortunate time in history ever, what Douglas Copeland calls winning the lottery. I grew up in Canada in the second half of the 20th century. A very peaceful society, one that a lot of people have decided was actually very dull, but I'll tell you, it was unbelievably fortunate. It still is. And at a time when things like, and don't worry, I'm not trying to subject you to I'm using this to explain difference. I'm not passing judgment on these two societies. It's about how we use stories to support one or other version. But so my Canada did things like sent people on peacekeeping missions and so on. Now, if you use the word, if you describe somebody, as our reporters often do, as wearing a blue beret or being on a UN peacekeeping outfit, you're essentially mocking not just their ambitions and how they operate in the field, but their practically, I can quote from you if you want, in the mainstream papers, their masculinity, everything. And it's regarded as a preposterous waste. It's not a coincidence that this happened at the same time as governments were talking about an axis of evil and so on. Because what they were doing, and I'll give you, there was a moment in 2006 where the Conservative government prohibited photographers and reporters from going to CFB Trenton and photographing the coffins of soldiers returning home. And to my mind, they were doing this because what they were trying to prevent was a humanist story of what might have been the individual life of a particular soldier, because that is exactly what a society in wartime cannot afford, the kind of story a society in wartime cannot afford to tell. Instead, they were using a kind of epic story in which we, as Canadians or as Americans or as British, but are valiant, courageous heroes, and the enemy are detestable scumbags and loathsome and basically not human, and you need that kind of conception of society in order to be able to sort of mobilize us against the threat on the boundaries. And I bring this up because, well, really because there's no more important player in all of this than all of you. And so I'm asking you to think a little bit about the stories that come your way. And think a little bit about what, if you have read, say, Deborah Ellis's book or Khaled Hosseini, what that does to you in the moment that you're reading it. Each of us, we go to the movies and we watch Lord of the Rings and we live in a kind of epic frame of mind at that moment. We cheer when thousands of orcs are slaughtered. It doesn't matter, it's a cartoon. But, we had reached this very progressive point where life was no longer quite that cartoon. And we were able, and if you believe in our common humanity, you're able to sort of begin by making that leap and questioning. That still may lead to a situation where you decide that a certain course of action is better than another. But it's just important to understand the manipulation of stories that are coming your way and what you're being asked to think versus what you'd be free to think if you understand the nature of the story that you're being told. I had said at the beginning that you live at a time in which technology is changing. The other thing, you can see this same progression of stories in what most of us now do. But you know, and I'll sort of end on this, but you know, stories also, they reflect the security that society feels. When you're telling epic stories and describing one society as monstrously evil and so on, you're operating from a high level of insecurity. When you feel more secure, you can start to consider our common humanity and start contemplating the possibility of a novel or what some other person's life is like. That is a lot of the time a reflection of the level of, as I say, economic security that we feel. We feel very threatened in the West at the moment, particularly because of oil and trade and so on. But there's another thing that happens, which is a bit, which is that stories begin by naming a place, much like a child draws pictures. You know, the child might begin by doing a tree. I'm sure you've all done this yourself, and the dog in the garden, maybe your mom in a house with 3 windows and a door and so on. That's the first thing that we do. We sort of name places with stories, and then we get to a point where we become much more sophisticated, and we use stories to map a place in its entirety. And then at the end we realize we've drawn the map, but the map is also a subjective thing, and somebody else comes with a different sort of idea of the map, and we enter into, in a very positive way, an argument about what it means to live with each other, which is the basic question that all novels are asking, which is, how do we get along? I think that's a very Canadian question. How do we you know, live with each other? That's the basic question of the novel. But as I said, with new technology, you're doing this already. When you do stuff on Facebook, you're basically painting the house of yourself, you're declaring it, you're claiming a bit of that virtual universe. That's a fairly early form of storytelling. When you play video games, now a bigger industry than the film industry, it's not an accident that so far, by far the majority of them involve chasing, hunting, and shooting somebody, because that's another very simple story to tell. It's like the epic one that involves good and evil and has no possibility of setting up something more sophisticated. Now it's your turn. You see, now you can use that new medium of the web, or perhaps you'll write books more conventionally. But to sort of, you have at your fingertips the possibility of telling some more complex and interesting story, more novel-like story, with this fantastic array of new tools at your command. I'm still waiting for this, seriously, somebody who can perhaps invent a bunch of characters on Facebook that aren't true and whole engagements before people catch on, who uses it, you know, to some further point. But you know, that's your gift, really. You know, I'm going to stop there. That was a jumble of ideas. I hope it wasn't. I hope it was a little bit interesting for you. I'd like to leave a little bit of time for, because you may have questions. And yeah, so thank you for being here.